Before I tell you this story, I need you to understand something about silence. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of sleep, the silence of a forest that has stopped breathing, the silence of every creature, every owl, every wolf, everything that lives in the dark, going completely still at the same moment, because something old has woken up, and it has caught a scent. She could feel it before she could name it, a pressure in the air, like the moment before lightning, when the sky hasn't cracked yet, but your skin already knows it's coming. Her name was Serafina. She was barefoot. Her wrists were bound in iron chains soaked in the blood of the fallen. Chains the elders said even a god could not break. She had been walked through the forbidden forest in the dark, in the cold, in the kind of quiet that has weight to it, and then they had chained her to a stone altar older than the pack's oldest memory, and left her there. No torch, no weapon, no last words of comfort, only one sentence spoken at her back, as the elders disappeared into the trees. He will devour you before sunrise. She did not scream after them. She did not beg. She stood in the dark, bleeding from where the chains had bitten her wrists, and she breathed slowly in out, because Serafina had decided somewhere between the village gates and the edge of the world that whatever came out of that forest to claim her, it would not find a girl on her knees. And in the deep dark of the forbidden forest, something stopped moving, something that had been pacing for 300 years, as if it had heard her decision. As if the silence between them had already begun to change shape. No one told the god that she wouldn't beg. No one warned her that he had been waiting not for a sacrifice, for her. Welcome back. Tonight's story is called They Chained Her to the Forbidden Wolf God as a Sacrifice. He chose her instead. Hold on to something, because once this begins, it does not let go. You need to understand what kind of world Ashvale was before you can understand what it cost to survive it. It was not a cruel place in the way that cruelty is usually built, not from hatred, not from war. It was cruel the way an old wound is cruel, quietly, permanently, from the inside. The village sat at the edge of the forbidden forest, the way a man sits next to something he fears, close enough to watch it, far enough to tell himself he is still in control. The pack of Ashvale had lived there for 11 generations. 11 generations of wolves who woke each morning under the shadow of those trees and made their peace with what lived inside them. They had a law, one law above all the others, above the Alpha's word, above the blood codes, above the ancient treaties that had kept the 5 territories from tearing each other apart for 3 centuries, every 100 years. When the blood moon swelled red and full above the forest, the trees woke up, not the way a forest stirs in wind, the way a prison stirs when something inside it remembers it is still alive. And when that happened, when the trees breathed, and the ground shook, and the silver in the sky turned the color of old blood, the elders of Ashvale walked to the center of the village square, opened the old book, and chose a name, a girl's name. She would be walked to the altar before midnight, chained, left. By sunrise, the forest would go quiet again, and the girl would be gone. No one asked where they went. No one looked. That was the law, and for 11 generations not one elder, not one alpha, not one warrior standing guard at the tree line with silver in his hands, not one of them had ever broken it until the night. They chose a girl who did not know how to disappear. Her name was Serafina Cole, and the first thing you must understand about her is this: she was not supposed to matter. She held no rank in the pack, no title, no bloodline worth noting in any record kept by any elder in any hall. She was what the pack called an ashborn, a human child born inside wolf territory, with no beast stirring beneath her skin, no shift waiting in her bones. To a pack where power was everything, where you were measured by the size of your wolf, the strength of your howl, the depth of your blood claim. Being ashborn was not simply a disadvantage. It was an erasure. She had grown up on the outside of everything, outside the training yards where the young wolves sparred at dawn, Outside the feasts, where the ranked families sat by firelight and spoke of territory and legacy and the names their children would one day carry, she had eaten at the edges, slept in a room at the back of the elder house because no family had claimed her, worked the leather stalls in the market because no pack position would take her. She had been invisible so long, she had almost believed it herself, almost, because here is the thing about Serafina that no one in Ashvale had ever taken the time to notice. She watched everything, while the pack looked inward, at rank, at bloodline, at the careful architecture of their own power. She watched the forest, every morning, every dusk. She would stand at the village's eastern edge, where the last stone house met the first dead tree, and she would look into the dark between the trunks, and she would feel something looking back, not a threat, not hunger, something stranger than either of those things, recognition. She never told anyone, she knew what they would say, that she was Ashbourne and imagining things, that the forest did not speak to girls without wolves, that she should stay away from the tree line. Before something inside it decided she was standing too close. So she kept the feeling locked behind her ribs, like a second heartbeat, steady, insistent, and entirely hers. To the elders who opened the book on the night of the blood moon, Serafina Cole was the simplest of choices. No family to grieve, no wolf to mourn, no rank to leave vacant, no one who would stand up in the square the next morning and demand to know what had happened to her. She was, in their careful and ancient and bloodless calculation, expendable. They were not wrong about any of the facts, they were only wrong about what those facts meant. Because Serafina Cole had survived 19 years of being called nothing, and a girl who has survived that does not break on an altar. And now the god, his name was Kale, not a name given to him by the pack, not a title granted by elders or carved into law by the blood mages who imprisoned him. His name was older than all of those things. It existed before the pack had language for what he was. He was the first alpha, not the first in a lineage, not the first of a generation, the first, the original, the one from whom every wolf that had ever shifted beneath a full moon carried a thread of blood, however thin, however distant, however many centuries removed. All wolves came from him, and 300 years ago, the elders of the original pack had looked at what they had come from, and decided they were afraid of it. They had called it protection, they had called it necessary, they had gathered the 5 most powerful blood mages of the age, drawn the oldest sealing circle known to wolfkind, and bound Kale to the deep forest with chains made not of iron, but of something worse, of law, of belief, of the collective will of every pack that had agreed to pretend he no longer existed. He did not fight it. That was the part the histories never explained correctly, the part that had always bothered the rare scholar who read them closely enough. He did not fight it. He simply waited 300 years in the dark of the forbidden forest, pacing the boundary of his prison the way a tide paces ashore, not with rage, not with the howling fury the pack stories had painted him with patience, the kind of patience that only something truly, fundamentally ancient is capable of, the kind that does not count years because years are a human measurement. And Kale had never been entirely human. The pack told stories about him. Of course, they said he had no mercy, that he had once leveled 3 villages in a single night because one of them had harbored a wolf who defied his law. They said he had no heart, that when his own mate had been killed in the war, before the imprisonment, he had felt nothing, only resumed walking, only kept going. They said his silver eyes could reach inside you and pull out the name you kept for yourself in your most private moments, the name you never said aloud, and speak it back to you. And that once that happened, you were his. 300 years of stories, 300 years of sacrifices sent to feed him, to keep him sleeping, to keep the old hunger quiet, so the packs could build their careful kingdoms in peace. They were right about 2 of those things they said about him, but which 2 is something only Serafina would ever find out, because she was the first one he had ever let close enough to ask. The blood moon rose The way all terrible things rise, slowly, and with complete certainty. It did not announce itself. It simply appeared above the tree line, bloated and red, the color of something that should be inside a body, and is not. It turned the whole sky the shade of an old wound, and beneath it, the village of Ashvale went completely still. And no fires lit in windows. No voices in the lanes. On nights like this, Ashvale did not exist. That was how they survived it. By becoming invisible to themselves. By drawing their curtains, locking their doors, closing their eyes, and waiting for sunrise to tell them it was over. Serafina had been given 1 hour to prepare. She had used it to memorize the faces of the 2 elders who came to collect her, not out of anger, not to curse them in her mind, simply because she had decided that if this was the last hour of her life, she would spend it seeing clearly. She would not blur the edges to make it easier. She would see every face, every stone, every dead tree they walked her past on the path into the forest. She would be present for all of it, even this. The forbidden forest swallowed them the moment they passed the tree line. Not gradually, not the way a forest deepens as you walk, where the light slowly thins, and the sounds of the world behind you slowly fade. It swallowed them at once, as if the trees had simply closed a door. 1 step. The village behind them, the red moon overhead, the faint smell of wood smoke and life. 1 step. Nothing. Only dark. Only the smell of earth that had not been turned in 3 centuries. Only the sound of the elders chanting, beginning, low and rhythmic, from somewhere ahead, and beneath that breath. And not the elders. Not the wolves beside her. The forest itself. Serafina felt it move through the ground before she heard it. A vibration, faint as a second pulse, running up through the soles of her bare feet and settling somewhere behind her sternum like a cold. Not hot, not cold. Simply present. Simply waiting. She knew then with the absolute, wordless certainty of a body that understands something before the mind can process it, that something in this forest was already aware of her, had been aware of her for longer than tonight, longer, perhaps, than she had been alive. The altar clearing opened before her like a held breath finally released. The stone was exactly as the old stories described it: low, wide, black with age, worn smooth at the center in a shape that fit a body if a body lay flat against it. The 6 torches burned in their ring. The other elders stood waiting, heads bowed, hands folded, mouths already moving through the binding words. And no one looked at her. That, somehow, was the hardest thing. Not the chains. Not the altar, not the red sky visible now through the break in the canopy above the clearing. The fact that every person here, every elder, every wolf, every living soul who had walked her to this place, was looking at the ground, because looking at her would have made her real, and it was easier to give a shadow to a god than a person. They chained her to the altar stone, her wrists, her ankles, iron links soaked in the blood of every girl who had stood here before her, every sacrifice going back to the first 100 years of blood soaked into metal, until the chains themselves had become something the elders called sacred. She did not cry. She had decided that in the village. When the elder read her name from the book, and the square went so quiet, she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She had decided then, she would not give them that. Not the tears. Not the begging. Not the spectacle of a girl unraveling at the edges so that everyone watching could feel that the right choice had been made, that she was soft enough to be spent. Her hands were shaking, but she kept them still at her sides, and she breathed through it, slow and deliberate. And she looked up through the gap in the canopy at the red moon above her, and she thought, if something is going to end tonight, let it end with me standing. The head elder spoke the binding words. They were not words in any language Serafina knew, not the common tongue of the 5 territories, not the old pack dialect she had heard in fragments from the elder house at night. These were older than language. They were sounds the throat made when the mind did not fully know what it was saying, shaped less like words and more like keys, fitted to a lock that had been built before memory. The chains tightened, not pulled, not adjusted by any hand. They simply contracted, the way a wound contracts when it begins to close, pressing her wrists flat against the altar stone with the pressure that was not quite pain. and not quite anything else. And then the torches changed. All 6 of them at once, orange to silver in a single breath. No transition, no flicker, no warning. One moment they were the warm, imprecise color of fire, and the next they were cold, precise, and ancient. Silver white, the color of his eyes. Though Serafina did not know that yet, the chanting stopped, and the elders ran. There was no ceremony in it, no dignified retreat, no formal closing of the ritual. They simply ran, 6 men who had presided over this rite for decades, who had walked girls to this altar with the measured calm of men who believed absolutely in what they were doing. They turned as one body, as if a single decision had moved through all of them simultaneously, and they fled into the trees. The sound of them crashing through the undergrowth lasted perhaps 10 seconds, and then there was nothing. Serafina was alone, alone in a clearing in the forbidden forest, chained to an altar older than the pack's oldest memory, beneath a blood moon, with 6 silver torches burning around her, and the most absolute silence she had ever heard, pressing against her eardrums like water at depth. She could feel him, not see him, not hear him, feel him, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives, the way the skin on the back of your neck registers something that has not yet happened. A weight in the dark at the edge of the clearing that had not been there a moment ago, something vast, something awake, something that had been waiting for a very long time, and had just decided to stop. Waiting. Don't run, don't run, don't tafe. Trees at the edge of the clearing did not bend. They parted, the way a crowd parts for someone whose presence makes standing in their path feel less like a choice and more like an error. No wind, no sound. The branches simply drew back, as if the forest itself was making room, or bowing. Serafina was never entirely sure which, and he walked out of the dark, slowly. That was the first thing that reached her. Not his size, not his eyes, not the way the silver torchlight seemed to recognize him and lean toward him as he moved. The slowness. He walked the way something moves when speed has never been a concern, when nothing has ever required him to hurry, when the concept of urgency belongs entirely to lesser things. He was enormous, not in the way of a large man, in the way of something that was built at a scale slightly wrong for the world it currently occupied, as if the clearing, which had seemed adequate a moment ago, was now simply too small a frame for what stood inside it. 8 feet, perhaps more, dark all of him, dark hair black as the space between stars, skin carrying the deep tan of a body that had existed long before sun or shade had opinions about it. He wore no armor, no pack markings, nothing that indicated rank or territory or allegiance to anything that currently existed. In the 5 territories, he predated all of that, and his eyes, silver, not the pale gray that some wolves carried in their shifted form, not the faint luminescence of a wolf at the edge of his power. True silver lit from the inside, ancient as the metal itself, as if whatever made the moon had made those eyes first as a draft and kept the design. They found her immediately, moved through the clearing like they already knew exactly where she was, had known before he stepped out of the dark, had perhaps known for longer than that. He looked at her, and he stopped. 300 years, sacrifice after sacrifice sent to this altar. 11 times the blood moon had risen, and 11 times the elders had walked a girl to this stone and chained her here. And not once in all that time, across all those girls, had Kale ever stopped walking when he reached the clearing. Till now, they sent me a human girl. Interesting. Her heart was slamming so hard against her ribs, she was certain. He could hear it. In fact, she was certain every creature in this forest could hear it, that it was the loudest thing in the clearing. This ordinary, terrified human heart running at twice its natural speed inside. A girl who had decided not to show fear to something that had probably never been refused it. She lifted her chin, not because she felt brave, because the only alternative was to let it drop, and she had promised herself on the altar stone that she would not bow, not to the elders who had chosen her, not to the pack that had never seen her, not to the chains, and not to him. If you're going to eat me, at least tell me your name first. He went very still. The Kind of still, that is. Not the absence of motion, but the presence of something trying to process an input it was not designed for. As if every system in that enormous, ancient body had received a signal it had no existing response to and was scrambling to build one from whatever it could find. 300 years. Not one of them had spoken first. Not one of them had looked at him. Truly looked. The way Serafina was looking. Now, chin up. Eyes steady. The kind of eye contact that said, I see you, and I am not going to pretend that I don't, and asked him anything. They had begged. They had bargained. They had screamed and prayed, and offered him things, and called out to gods older than themselves to intervene. None of them had asked for his name. He laughed. It was not a sound that belonged in this century. It came from somewhere deep and unexercised, as if the mechanism existed, but had not been used in so long that it surprised even him. Rough at the edges, low in the chest, and carrying beneath it something she was not prepared for. Warmth. Not much, just a trace, a thread of it, buried under 300 years of cold and dark and solitude. But it was there, and it moved through the silver torch, air of that clearing like the first suggestion of fire in a room that had been shut up since winter. He crouched down, slowly, bringing those enormous silver eyes, level with hers, closer than anything alive should have dared to stand to her in this moment. Close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, like a second source of light. He looked at her face, the way you look at something written in a language you once spoke, and have not spoken in a very long time, working through each feature carefully, searching for the meaning you used to know by instinct, feeling it come back to you in pieces. And then he said it, you are not afraid of me. Oh, I'm absolutely terrified of you. I'm just not going to let you see it. The chains did not snap. They did not strain or buckle or shatter under force. There was no sound of metal giving way, no violence of any kind. They simply ceased. As if they had been a question, and he had just answered it. As if the iron links soaked in 100 years of blood and binding, and the collective belief of 11 generations of elders had, in the presence of whatever this was between them, quietly lost faith in their own purpose. The pieces fell away from her wrists and dissolved before they hit the altar stone, like they had never existed. Serafina stared at her wrists. The marks were still there, red lines, where the iron had bitten, but her hands were free. She was standing on an altar in the forbidden forest, unchained, in front of the forbidden wolf god, with nothing between them but 3 feet of silver-lit air and the most charged silence she had ever stood inside. He rose to his full height, and he looked at her with those ancient eyes, and in them she saw, not hunger, not the consuming dark thing the stories had described, not the void that was supposed to swallow you whole. She saw 300 years of waiting. She saw what a thing looks like when it has been alone so long that it has almost forgotten what it was alone for. She saw recognition. He did not know her name yet. He did not know her history. The elder house, the market stalls, the 19 years of standing at the edge of every room she had ever occupied. He did not know what she had felt at the tree line every morning when she stood and looked into his forest and felt something look back. He knew none of it. He only knew that something deep in his chest, in the place where 3 centuries of cold had built itself into a structure he had stopped expecting to ever change, had just moved, the way the first stone shifts before an avalanche, quiet, almost imperceptible, and absolutely irreversible. He chose her, not because the law required it, not because the blood moon demanded something of him, not because of any old code or ancient hunger, or the weight of 300 years pressing him toward the nearest available thing. He chose her the way the tide chooses the shore, not with decision, exactly, but with the absolute inevitability of 2 things that were always going to meet. He did not say it yet. He did not know yet the word for what this was, but the forest knew. Every root and branch and dead leaf in a mile of ancient trees the forest knew, and it exhaled, for the first time in 300 years. The forbidden forest exhaled, Word moves through a pack the way blood moves. Through a body faster than thought, faster than decision, driven by something older and more fundamental than either. By the time the sun had cleared the tree line east of Ashvale, every pack in the 5 territories had heard it. The sacrifice had not been consumed. The god had not slept. The girl was gone, not devoured, not dissolved into the ritual, as 11 girls before her had been dissolved, but gone as in walking, gone as in alive, gone as in somewhere inside the forbidden forest with the chained god. Unchained, beside her. In the border villages, people locked their doors and did not speak of it aloud. In the elder halls of the southern packs, the senior wolves gathered in circles and lowered their voices and used words like unprecedented and unknown, variable, and we need to wait and observe. In Blackcrest Castle, a man named Draven threw the messenger's report across the war table and stood very still for a long time, staring at the territory map spread beneath his hands. He did not rage. That was the first thing his general noticed, the thing that made the general's blood run colder than the news itself. Because Alpha King Draven raged well. He had the size for it and the history for it, and 20 years of rule had given him ample occasion to perfect it. His anger was a known quantity. His anger was manageable. His stillness was not. His stillness meant he was thinking, and when Draven thought carefully, completely, without interruption, things changed in the 5 territories. Borders shifted. Alliances reformed. Packs that had existed for generations suddenly found themselves absorbed or dismantled or quietly made irrelevant by a single decision handed down from a castle on a cliff. He was not cruel in the way the stories painted rulers. He was not a man who took pleasure in dominance or drew satisfaction from the suffering of the small. He was something considerably harder to fight than that. He was correct, almost always. In almost every situation, Draven was correct, and he knew it. And his knowing it had calcified over 2 decades into something that looked like confidence from the outside and felt, from the inside of his own mind, like simply seeing clearly while everyone else squinted. He had built the sacrifice system, not invented it. It was older than his bloodline by centuries, but he had maintained it, formalized it, turned a frightened folk ritual into a precise geopolitical instrument. Every 100 years, one girl, one ritual, one period of controlled contact with the force that could otherwise unmake everything he had spent his life constructing. It was inelegant. He knew that. He had always known that, but it had worked. For 300 years it had worked. And Draven had built his kingdom on the foundation of things that worked. And now, because of one girl, one Ashborn nobody from a border village who should have been the simplest variable in the entire equation, it had not worked. He looked up from the maps. His general was waiting. The orders he gave in that war room were clean, efficient. The orders of a man who has already run every scenario and selected the one with the smallest margin for error. 20 warriors, not a show of force. A precision instrument. His best trackers, his most disciplined fighters, all of them armed with silver-tipped arrows and enchanted chain. Men who had trained for exactly this kind of operation, who had been told since their induction into the Black Crest Guard that one day the god might wake, and they would need to be ready. Their objective was simple: find the girl, capture her, return her to Black Crest before the god understood what was happening. And then, when his general had received the formal orders and turned to go, Draven spoke again, quietly, the way he always spoke, the things that mattered most, as if volume were for men who needed to convince themselves they meant what they said. He did not need convincing. If the god follows her out of the forced way, don't bring her back. We use her where she stands. He'll come for her, whatever she is to him, and I intend to find out. He'll come, and when he does, we'll be ready for him. Do not tell the men what she is for. Tell them she's a variable we need to control. That's true enough. His general left without a word. Draven turned back to the territory maps on his table and studied the forbidden forest. That dark and irregular shape pressed against the eastern border of Ashvale, like a fist against a chest. And he thought about The girl whose name he still didn't know, Dada and Ashbourne. The messenger had said. No rank, no wolf, no family of note, nobody. He had been moving pieces on this board for 20 years. He knew every pack, every bloodline, every alliance held together by treaty, and everyone held together only by the shared understanding that defying Black Crest was a thing you did once. He had never once moved a piece that surprised him. Serafina Cole had not been on his board at all. That, more than anything else, more than the failed ritual, more than the god's freedom, more than the whispers already moving through the 5 territories, was what kept Draven standing at that table long after his general had gone. He did not know what she was, and for the first time in 20 years of rule, not knowing something frightened him. Serafina knew none of this. She knew the weight of her own bare feet on the forest floor. She knew the ache in her wrists where the chains had been. She knew the strange, disorienting sensation of walking through a forest that should have been terrifying and finding instead that it felt not safe, exactly, but honest. As if the forbidden forest had stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. And there was a kind of relief in that, after a lifetime spent inside a village that pretended constantly. And she knew the figure walking 10 feet ahead of her, who had not spoken in 2 hours. Kale moved through his forest the way water moves through its own riverbed, not navigating, not choosing, simply occupying the space that had always been shaped for him. The trees did not block his path. The undergrowth did not catch at him. The dark parted where he walked, and closed again behind him like a tide. She had to step quickly to keep the distance from widening. She watched the back of him as she walked, the breadth of his shoulders, the unhurried certainty of each step, the way he carried 300 years of solitude, not as a wound, but as a weight, something he had grown so accustomed to that he no longer shifted his posture around it. It was simply part of him now, the way old injuries become part of the body they inhabit. She thought about asking where they were going. She thought about asking what happened now, what freedom looked like for a god who had been imprisoned for 3 centuries. What the plan was, whether there was a plan, whether gods made plans or simply moved through the world and let the world adjust. She did not ask any of it. The silence between them had a texture not hostile, not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 things that are still deciding what they are to each other, and she had enough sense to let that deciding happen at its own pace. She had just been freed from an altar by the forbidden wolf god. She could afford to wait 2 hours for a conversation. She was thinking about whether the feeling in her wrists was the beginning of bruises or the end of them. When the first arrow hit the tree beside her head, she didn't hear it coming. That was the first thing. No whistle, no warning, no sound of a bowstring releasing. The enchanted silver moved through the air without friction, without the normal physics of a fired arrow, and struck the bark 1 inch from her left ear with a crack that snapped through the forest like a bone breaking. The second came from the opposite side. She dropped instinctively. Not a trained response, not the practiced maneuver of a fighter, but the body's oldest instruction, the one written into the base of the spine before thought existed. Get low, get small, survive. The second arrow passed through the space where her head had been. The third did not miss. It caught her across the upper arm. Not deep, not through bone, graze in the precise clinical sense of the word, but silver-tipped and enchanted, and it opened a line of fire across her skin that was entirely disproportionate to the wound itself. As if the metal had opinions about her blood, she went down hard, left knee, then both hands, forest floor coming up fast and cold beneath her palms. Her vision went briefly white at the edges. She pressed her right hand over the wound and felt heat. Too much of it. The specific burning heat of silver against skin that should not react to silver the way hers suddenly was. She had no time to think about what that meant. Okay. I think the pack found mesh did not finish the sentence, because in the half second between the third arrow striking and the fourth, leaving the bow in that sliver of time that the human eye cannot fully track and the human mind cannot fully process, Kale moved, not toward the archers, not through the trees in any direction that could be described as forward or sideways or strategic. he simply relocated. The way a shadow relocates when the light source changes. One moment, 10 feet ahead of her on the path. The next, crouching at her side, one hand braced against the ground beside her, the other raised. The fourth arrow stopped between 2 fingers, 1 inch from her throat. He held it there, did not snap it, did not throw it down. He simply held it, those silver eyes moving from the shaft of the arrow down to the wound on her arm, studying it the way you study something that has made a decision you intend to reverse. Then he straightened and turned to face the tree line. 20 of Draven's warriors stepped out of the forest in a disciplined arc, silver weapons raised, formation tight. The movements of men who had trained for this specific scenario and believed that training was enough. They wore black crest markings on their armor. They carried the steady posture of soldiers who served the most powerful Alpha King in the 5 territories and had never once had reason to doubt that that meant something. Kale looked at them, not with rage, not with the particular heat of someone who has been offended, with the flat, absolute attention of something ancient, looking at something temporary and calculating, without cruelty, exactly how temporary. His silver eyes had gone dark, not dim, dark, a different thing entirely, as if the light in them had not diminished, but deepened, dropping below a frequency the visible world could access. As if something that lived underneath the surface of him had just risen to it. You brought weapons into my forest. You have 10 seconds to leave it. The lead warrior, a man who had held his position for 12 years, who had faced down rogue alphas and shifted beasts and blood mages in the service of his king, and had never once considered retreat without an order, looked into those darkened silver eyes, and his hands tightened on his weapon, not because he was brave enough to defy what he was seeing, because his hands were the only part of him still responding to his training, and the rest of him had already understood something his training had no category for. 10 seconds passed. And 01 moved. And 01 left. What followed was not a battle in any sense that warranted the word. A battle implies 2 sides with comparable standing. It implies exchange blow for blow. Strategy against strategy. The careful navigation of 2 forces that recognize each other as equal enough to require effort. This was not that. This was the world correcting a misunderstanding. Kale did not shift. That was what the warriors were prepared for. The shift, the wolf form, the ancient and enormous beast they had studied in every historical account they could find. The thing they had silver weapons to wound and enchanted chain to bind. He stayed exactly as he was, human-shaped, standing in the center of the forest clearing. And then, he moved through 20 armed warriors the way a current moves through standing water. Not against them, not around them, simply through in a series of motions that the human eye could not fully assemble into sequence no matter how hard it tried. A warrior's silver blade met something that was not quite his hand and was redirected so cleanly. It seemed like a suggestion rather than a deflection. The man behind it stumbling 6 feet sideways into a tree trunk and sitting down, bewildered, unharmed, but completely unwilling to stand back up. An arrow loosed at point-blank range, stopped mid-air and fell, just fell, as if it had forgotten its purpose. 2 warriors who tried to flank him moving in practiced concert. The maneuver that had taken down 3 different rogue alphas in the past decade, found themselves facing the wrong direction without understanding how they had been turned around, standing back to back with their weapons pointing at the empty trees. And blood. That was the part that reached through Serafina's shock and settled in her chest like a cold stone. He could have ended every single one of them, and he was not. He was dismantling them carefully, methodically, the way you take apart a mechanism you do not wish to destroy, but cannot allow to keep running, removing each piece from the equation with the minimum force required, laying them aside. Inside 90 seconds, 20 warriors were standing or sitting or slumped in various attitudes of profound reconsideration around the clearing, none of them critically wounded, none of them in any condition to continue, and all of them, to a man, looking at Kale with the specific expression of someone who has just been shown the precise and personal distance between what they thought they were capable of and what they actually are. Serafina had not moved. She was still on the ground, where the third arrow had put her, one hand over the wound on her arm, watching the entire thing with the focused, unblinking attention of someone who understands they are witnessing something they will spend a long time trying to find adequate words for. She watched him turn from the last standing warrior, a young soldier, barely older than herself, who had dropped his weapon and was simply staring, and walk back to her without hurry, without triumph, with the same unhurried certainty he applied to everything, as if those 90 seconds had cost him nothing, had required no more of him than standing up required of anyone else. He crouched back down beside her. His eyes had returned to silver. She looked at him, and something she had been carefully, deliberately not thinking, since the moment the chains dissolved forced itself to the front of her mind, and stayed there. He had not been between her and the arrows because she was his prize. He had not dismantled 20 armed men because they had entered his territory. He could have let the arrows find her, and simply stepped over the result and walked back into his forest alone, as he had always been alone, as he was apparently supposed to remain. He had not done that. He had moved without hesitation, before thought, before decision. The way a body moves when something it cannot afford to lose is suddenly in danger. The way instinct moves when it is older and more honest than reason. He had fought for her, not the sacrifice, not the ritual, not the blood moon's offering, or the pack's appointed variable, or the ashborn. Nobody from a border village. Her. She did not say it aloud. She was not ready to say it aloud. But sitting there on the forest floor, with silver fire burning across her arm, and 20 of the Alpha King's finest warriors in various states of silent, bewildered defeat around the clearing, she felt it land in her chest like a second heartbeat finding its rhythm. Something had claimed her tonight, not with chains, not with law, not with the cold machinery of ritual and sacrifice, and the needs of a pack that had never once considered whether she had needs of her own. Something had claimed her by choosing, and it had not even said it yet, but it did not need to. The forest already knew, and some old, patient, long buried part of her had always known too. The cave sat behind a waterfall at the deep center of the forest, a place Serafina was certain appeared on no map drawn by any cartographer in the 5 territories. Because a place like this was not something you found by looking, you arrived at it because something that knew the forest decided to bring you there. The water fell in a continuous sheet across the entrance, white and constant, softening the world outside into a blur of green and dark, and the faint remnant red of the blood moon still bleeding into the sky. Inside, the sound of it filled everything. Not loud, not violent, simply present the way breathing is present. The cave breathed water. The fire existed before she could ask about it. She had not seen him light it. She had followed him through the waterfall, gasping at the cold of it, water plastering her hair flat and her clothes to her skin. And when she turned, blinking, into the amber interior of the cave, the fire was simply there, low and steady, old light, orange gold, with none of the flicker of uncertainty about it that ordinary fires carry. It burned the way he moved, as if it had always been here, and had only been waiting for someone to notice. He sat on the far side of it, not close, not deliberately distant, simply at the edge of the firelight, where the amber thinned into shadow, as if he was not entirely certain how much of himself to offer to the light, as if he had spent so long in the dark that warmth required him to negotiate with it rather than simply accept it. Serafina sat on her side and wrung the water from her hair, and said nothing. She had learned, in the hours since the altar, that silence with Kale was not emptiness. It was a medium like water, like air through which things moved that had not yet become words. Pushing it always felt like the wrong instinct. Waiting in it felt, strangely, like the right one. So she waited, and she watched the fire, and she felt the wound on her arm still burning beneath her hand with that disproportionate silver heat. And she thought about the look on the lead warrior's face when Kale had turned toward the tree line, and she thought about the chains dissolving, and she thought about 100 years of girls chained to an altar stone. And she pressed her hand harder against the wound, and stared into the fire, and she waited. Then, without looking at her. He spoke. Your wound needs to be closed. Give me your arm. She hesitated, not from fear. She had passed through fear hours ago and come out somewhere else. Somewhere that did not yet have a name, but felt, strangely, like ground. She hesitated because extending her arm across a fire toward the forbidden wolf god in a cave behind a waterfall was the kind of action she wanted to be deliberate about. Wanted to choose with full awareness rather than simply let happen. She chose it, moved her hand away from the wound, and held her arm out across the firelight. Palm up. The gash, dark and silver, burned against her skin. He reached across and took it. She had expected cold. Everything about him suggested cold. The silver eyes, the dark, the 3 centuries of isolation, the particular stillness of something that has not been touched in so long that warmth seems like a concept that belongs to another category of being entirely. His hands were warm, not the ordinary warmth of a body running at its natural temperature, something older than that, a warmth that had weight to it, that pressed into the skin rather than simply sitting against it. Ancient warmth, the kind that predates fire, that was present before human hands learned to make it, that exists in the deep places of the earth where sunlight has never reached, but heat remains regardless. He pressed his palm flat over the wound, and she felt it move through her. Not pain, not the specific, clean sensation of a wound being knit shut from the outside in. Something else entirely, something that traveled from the point of his touch upward through her arm, across her collarbone, down into her chest, and settled there like a coal, finding a hearth that had been waiting for it. Old light. That was the only language she had for it afterward. Old light, the kind that does not illuminate so much as it simply is, the way the first light of the world simply was before there were eyes to receive it. She felt it move through her blood like recognition. Like something coming home to a house it had been locked out of for a very long time. He lifted his palm. The wound was gone, not scarred, not healed in the visible, layered way of skin that has rebuilt itself. Gone as if it had never been. The skin was smooth and unmarked and faintly warm where his hand had been, and she stared at it for a long moment before she stared at him. What are you? He was quiet for a moment. That felt like it had geological layers to it. Depth upon depth of consideration, of deciding how much of the truth to give, and in what form, to a creature he had known for less than a single night and could not stop watching. Across a fire, then he spoke, and what struck her, what would stay with her long after the words themselves had been turned over and examined from every angle, was not the content of what he said, but the quality of his voice when he said it. The particular texture of someone speaking a truth they have not spoken aloud in so long that they are relearning the shape of it as it comes out. As if the words existed in him like an old wound that had closed over the surface but never fully healed beneath, and saying them was both the opening of it and the first real air it had felt since before the imprisonment. I was the first, before Pax, before kings, before law and territory, and the careful architecture of rules that men build when they are afraid of what lives inside them, was what the wolf was before men decided what the wolf was allowed to, not a beast, not a soldier, not a thing to be ranked and measured and deployed, something older than all of that, something that existed when the world was still deciding what it was. They imprisoned me because they were afraid of what I represented, not what I had done, what I made possible. Power that could not be owned, cannot be controlled, cannot be traded, cannot be folded into a bloodline or passed down through a lineage or used to justify the authority of one man over another. Power that simply is. Men who build kingdoms cannot survive the existence of that. So they put it in a forest and fed it to keep it quiet and called it protection. That's why they kept sending sacrifices. Not to feed you, because you needed it. To keep you distracted. To keep you sleeping. To give you just enough presence, just enough contact that you would not feel the full weight of what had been taken. They were managing you the way you manage a fire. You're afraid to extinguish completely. The fire crackled between them, A single log shifted and sent a slow coil of amber light across the cave wall, across the wet stone, across the curtain of falling water at the entrance, across his face. He looked at her, not the way he had looked at her on the altar, reading her, cataloging her, searching for the thing he recognized and could not yet name. This was different. This was the look that comes after recognition, after the thing has been named and the naming of it has changed the namer. 300 years, he had spoken those words, the truth of what he was, the truth of what had been done in his own mind 10,000 times, in the dark of the forest, pacing the boundary of his prison, in the long months between blood moons, in the absolute solitude of centuries. He had held the truth of it like a stone in his chest, heavy, cold, entirely his. And no one had ever said it back to him. And no one had ever heard it, and immediately, cleanly, with no hesitation or negotiation, understood. You are the first one who has ever understood that. She should have left it there. That would have been the sensible thing, the careful thing, the guarded thing that a girl with any self-preserving instinct would have done. She had enough to process already. The altar, the chains, the arrows, the way his hands had been warm when she expected cold, the way the wound had not closed, but simply ceased to have ever existed. She had more than enough for one night, but the question had been sitting in her chest since the moment the chains dissolved, since the moment she had looked into those ancient eyes and seen something that was not hunger and not threat and not the consuming dark void of the stories. And it had been sitting there through the forest walk and the ambush and the cave and the healing, waiting with the patient persistence of something that knows it will eventually be asked. She asked it, "Why did you free me? Not why didn't you consume me? Not why did you break the ritual? Why did you free me? You could have dissolved the chains and walked back into your forest. You could have looked at me and decided I was not your concern and left me standing on that altar stone in the dark. You have been alone for 300 years. You were capable of remaining alone. So why did you bring me with you?" He did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, not evasive, but full. The silence of someone navigating toward an honest answer across terrain that has not been walked in a very long time, moving carefully, because the answer is difficult, but because it is true. And truth of a certain kind requires this kind of care in the approach. The fire dipped low, rose again. The waterfall continued its white curtain across the entrance, indifferent and eternal. Then low, with the quality of a man speaking not quite to her, but slightly past her, toward some interior place where the answer had been waiting long before the question existed. Because you didn't beg, every soul they sent to that altar, every single one, for 300 years begged, they screamed, they bargained, they offered me things, their pack's loyalty, their blood, old debts owed to people who had been dead for generations. They called on gods older than themselves to intervene, as if I was not the oldest thing in the forest and could somehow be outranked. Every one of them looked at me and saw what they had been told to see: monster, devourer, the thing at the end of the story, where the story stops. You looked at me and asked for my name. I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as something that has a name, to be spoken to rather than spoken at. To have someone stand in front of me terrified, chained, in the dark and still treat me as something worth asking. 300 years is a long time to be only what someone else decided you were. You gave me something back. On that altar, I am not certain yet what to call it, but I know I am not willing to let it walk away. The cave held the silence after his words with the same care that it held the firelight. Completely, without interruption, without the world outside intruding. Serafina looked at him across the fire. The breadth of him, the dark stillness of him, the way the amber light moved across the planes of his face and made the silver of his eyes look almost gold. She thought about what 300 years felt like from the inside, whether time, at that scale, became something different, not a succession of days, but a single sustained condition, a permanent present tense with no future visible inside it. She thought about 19 years of standing at the edge of every room, of eating where the light didn't reach, of sleeping in the back room of the elder house because no family had written her name down as theirs, of standing every morning at the village's eastern edge and feeling the forest looking back at her and knowing, in that pre-language place beneath the ribs where the truest things live, that she was being seen by something that the world she occupied had decided was only a threat. She thought about that, and then she thought, we have both been this, both of them entirely different ways, invisible to the world that had made them, both of them in the same forest, on the same night. Finding the only other thing that understood what that cost, she made a decision. She would not call it brave afterward, and she would not call it foolish. She would only call it true, the kind of action that bypasses the whole machinery of deliberation, because something in the body already knows, and the body, in this particular moment, was older and wiser than anything her mind could offer. She reached across the fire, and she placed her hand over his. He froze, every part of him, all 8 feet of ancient, unchained, impossible power went completely, utterly still. The way something goes still when it has been reached for so rarely that being reached for it all requires a full recalibration of every system it possesses. Not shock, not fear, the body's equivalent of a breath held because breathing might break it, because if he moved, if he did anything at all, this might become a different thing than it currently was. And whatever it currently was, whatever this weight of her small, warm hand against the back of his, whatever this quiet, impossible kindness, he was not ready for it to be anything other than exactly this. And no one in 300 years had touched him like that, not with purpose, not with the particular intention of a touch that says without words, without negotiation, without anything so blunt as a declaration. I see you, and I am not afraid of what I see. And I am still here, 300 years, and this 19-year-old girl from a village that had called her nobody was the first. The fire burned between them. The waterfall fell, the forest beyond it, which had been alive with the careful listening of every creature Kale had ever known, held itself as still as the moment before the first howl of the world, waiting to see what he would do, waiting to see what it meant, for the first alpha to be chosen. To be reached for. To be seen not as a monster, not as a god, not as a weapon, or a warning, or a force of nature requiring management, but as something that had a name, and deserved to be asked for it. He did not send a second wave. That would have been the response of a man who still believed the first approach had simply been insufficient. More men, better weapons, a revised strategy applied to the same problem. Draven understood, with the cold clarity that had built his kingdom stone by stone across 2 decades, that the first approach had not failed from insufficient force. It had failed because the equation had changed, because there was now a variable in the forest that he had not accounted for, and you did not manage a new variable by throwing the same tools at it harder. You came yourself. You brought everything, and you stood at the center of it, because the center was the only place from which you could see clearly enough to adjust. He arrived at the forest's edge as the last of the night bled out of the sky and the dawn came in, gray and cold, and offering nothing in the way of comfort. 500 men behind him in full formation, black crest banners unfurling in the morning wind, like a declaration rather than a signal. Because Draven did not signal, he declared. Every element of his approach was legible, intentional, designed to communicate a single message before a word had been spoken. I have already calculated this, and I have already won. The siege weapons sat on their wheeled frames 30 yards back, silver-laced explosive charges, each one capable of leveling 3 acres of old-growth forest, each one aimed at the tree line with the kind of precise calibration that only came from engineers who had been building toward this specific moment for years. Because Draven had been building toward this moment for years, he had simply hoped it would never be necessary. The rear, in unmarked robes that drew the eye because they declined to be noticed, the blood mage stood with both hands at his sides, and his eyes already moving across the tree line, reading it, cataloging it, searching for the specific texture of ancient imprisonment magic in the air, looking for the threads he had spent a decade learning to find, so he could learn to pull them. Everything was in place. Draven stopped at the boundary where the open land met the first shadow of the forest, the precise line where the world of the 5 territories ended and something older began. And he stood there in his black armor, in the gray morning light, and he spoke, not loudly. He never needed to be loud. The forest would carry his voice because the forest had no choice, and everything in it would hear him because he required that it did. Kale, I know you can hear me. I am not here for a battle. I have never wanted a battle with you. That has always been true. Whatever you were told about why the imprisonment was necessary, I am here because something changed last night that cannot remain changed. Because there is a balance in these territories that has held for 300 years, and the holding of it has cost everyone, including you, and I have no personal interest in what was sacrificed to maintain it, but I do have an interest in it. Continuing, send out the girl. Let me return her to Ashvale. Let me close what was open last night, and I will give you another 100 years of peace. Not imprisonment, not the ritual, not a sacrifice. A genuine treaty. Your forest, your boundary, your law. Undisturbed. Keep her, and I will burn every tree in this forest to the root, until there is nothing left for you to stand in. Oh, there is nowhere left for what? You are to exist. You have until I decide you have had long enough. His voice reached through the waterfall, and the stone, and the amber warmth of the cave like a blade through cloth. Clean, cold, entirely without effort. Serafina heard every word. She had been sitting beside the dying fire when it reached her close enough to the embers that she could still feel the last of the heat against her palms. And she heard it the way you hear something that has been true for a long time, finally spoken aloud. Not with surprise, with recognition. They had always been coming for her. The ritual had been designed to make her disappear quietly, with no one left to ask questions about where she had gone. When that had failed, the 20 warriors had been designed to retrieve her with the minimum disturbance. Now that that had failed, Draven had brought everything. Not because Serafina Cole, Ashborn nobody, was worth 500 men and a blood mage, and siege weapons, but because whatever she was to Kale was worth all of that and more. And Draven was a man who had never once underpriced a threat. She stood up. Kale was already at the cave entrance, filling the space between the falling water and the interior dark with the kind of presence that made the cave itself seem like it was holding its breath. He had heard Draven's voice before she had. She could see it in the line of his shoulders. Not tension, not fear, but something she had begun to learn to read in the short time she had known him. The stillness that preceded absolute decision. He turned, and he looked at her the way a wall looks, not unkindly, but completely. Stay here. Oh, they came for me. They came for me on the altar, and they came for me in the forest. And now, they are standing at your tree line with 500 men, and they are threatening to burn your world to the ground. Because of me, I will not hide in a cave while someone uses my existence as the price of your destruction. I am going to finish this. He looked at her for a long moment. That same look, the one from the altar that she was beginning to understand, was not simply reading her, but something more specific than that, something closer to witnessing, the look of a thing that has been alone with its own judgment for so long that encountering another person whose judgment it cannot find fault with is an experience it has no existing category for. He was searching for the argument that would change her mind. He did not find one, because she was right. She had always been the center of this, and sending her away from it would not make it smaller. It would simply mean she was absent from the resolution of the thing she was the center of. And that was something he found surprising himself, that he was not willing to accept. He stepped aside. They walked out of the forest together. She felt it the moment her foot crossed the boundary, not when she saw Draven's army arranged across the open field like a dark tide held at the shore by the force of its own discipline, not when the morning wind carried the smell of silver and explosives and the specific, metallic cold of 500 weapons ready to be used, not when Draven's eyes found hers across the distance between them, and she watched him recalibrate, watched him take in what she looked like, this nobody from Ashvale, and find something in her face that made him go very still the way he had gone still. In the war room. It was the boundary itself, the precise line where the forbidden forest's ancient claim on the land released its grip, and the open world of the 5 territories began that hairline threshold between what Kale's power had held for 3 centuries and everything outside it. Her bare foot crossed it, and the world inside her cracked. Not pain. She had been bracing for pain, for the violence of change, for the physical reckoning of a body discovering it had been something other than what it believed itself to be. She had heard enough pack stories, enough accounts of first shifts, to know that transformation tended to announce itself in the body with something close to suffering. This was not that. This was release. The specific, overwhelming, undeniable sensation of a thing that has been held under pressure for its entire existence, finally finding the absence of the walls that contained it. Like a river meeting the sea, like a breath drawn after being held so long, the lungs had forgotten what full felt like. Something in her blood, something old and silver and entirely patient, something that had been waiting in the deepest architecture of her body since before she was born, since before her mother was born, since before the line of women who carried it had any way to understand what they were carrying. Rose.it did not ask for permission. It had been waiting for 300 years. Permission was not a concept it had any remaining interest in. She felt it move through her the way the old light had moved through her when Kale healed the wound. But larger, older, not warmth, but fire. Not the warmth of a hearth, but the warmth of the first sun the world had ever turned its face toward, before there were names for warmth, or sun, or face, or world. A wolf. Not around her, not approaching her, not something separate coming to claim her, inside her, always inside her, sealed and silent and waiting. Sealed by the same blood magic that had chained Kale to the forest, because whatever she was to him, the elders of 300 years ago had understood it well enough to know that if she ever woke, the imprisonment would end. And so they had sealed her too. Not in a forest, in her own blood, in the Ashbourne designation, the human label, the careful erasure of every piece of evidence that she was anything other than the nobody they needed her to be. The seal broke the way the chains had broken, not with violence, with the quiet, absolute certainty of something that no longer believed in the thing containing it. 500 warriors watched the Ashbourne girl from Ashvale, the nobody, the expendable, the one whose name had been chosen precisely because losing her would cost nothing. Shift. White. Not the gray-brown of a common wolf. Not the black of the high bloodline fighters or the silver of the old alpha families. White, the specific, blazing, absolute white of moonlight given a body. Of the moon itself, deciding it had been hanging in the sky long enough, and had things to attend to on the ground. She was enormous. Not in the way of a large wolf. In the way of something that had been compressed into an insufficient space for 19 years, and was now, for the first time, the size it had always been meant to be. She threw back her head, and Kale answered her before the sound had fully left her throat. His howl was not a sound. It was a fact about the nature of the world, about what the world had been before men decided to subdivide it into territories and bloodlines, and carefully maintain balances of power. It was the sound the earth makes when it remembers what it is, when the oldest thing in it surfaces, briefly, from underneath the accumulated weight of 300 years of being managed and contained and fed enough to stay quiet, and simply speaks in its own voice. The ground moved. Not violently, not the upheaval of an earthquake or the destruction of something collapsing. The ground moved the way the ground moves when something deep inside it resonates with something above it, when the bones of the world recognize a sound and answer it with their own. Below the frequency of human hearing, felt only in the feet and the chest and the oldest part of the spine, 500 armored men felt it through their boots simultaneously, and the forbidden forest roared. Every tree, every root, every branch of every dead and living thing in a mile of ancient forest vibrated with the sound of two things that had been separated by 3 centuries of deliberate, fearful architecture, finally occupying the same space at the same moment. The first Alpha and the first Luna, the prophecy the elders had buried so deeply that the burial itself had become the lore. The one the blood mages had built the imprisonment around. The one Draven had never read because the record of it had been destroyed before his grandfather's grandfather had taken the Black Crest throne. And so he had managed the god without ever knowing what the god was waiting for. He knew. Now, the blood mage was the first to go. He felt it in his tools before the sound finished. Leaving the forest, the specific sensation of every working he had spent a decade building unwinding simultaneously, like a braid coming apart, like scaffolding removing itself. He looked at his hands. His instruments were cold. Every thread of the ray imprisonment working he had come here to execute was simply gone. Not disrupted. Dissolved. As if the magic he had built his entire professional existence around had looked at what was standing at the forest's edge and quietly decided it did not apply here. He dropped everything he was holding, and he walked away from the army without asking permission, without looking back, at a pace that was almost, but not quite running, because somewhere deep in his trained and ancient understanding of how power worked, he knew with absolute certainty that there was no longer anything useful he could do here, and that remaining was not a choice he was willing to make. The siege weapons were next, not destroyed by any force applied to them, not struck or overloaded or dismantled by any hand. The wood of their frames simply gave. Decades-old treated timber engineered to withstand enormous stress. Maintained annually, inspected before this campaign by Draven's own engineers. Developed cracks and then gaps, and then collapsed quietly into themselves as if they had simply decided their structural integrity was no longer a priority they could support. The silver-laced charges hit the ground and did not detonate, and the warriors 500 men who had marched to this field in the absolute conviction that they served the most powerful authority in the 5 territories and that conviction was enough, began, one by one, and then in dozens, and then all at once, to step back. No order given. No officer commanded the retreat. They simply stepped back the way the body steps back from fire before the mind has decided to, because something in each of them, below the rank and the training and the 20 years of believing that Black Crest meant something absolute, recognized what was standing at the forest's edge and issued an instruction that their legs obeyed before their pride could form an objection, and Draven stood alone at the front of his retreating army, at the edge of the open field, facing the forest boundary, and the two things standing at it, the white wolf and the god beside her, silver-eyed and enormous and entirely still. And for the first time in 20 years of uninterrupted correct decisions, Alpha King Draven had nothing. No next move. No calculated response. No variable he could pull from the equation to change its outcome. Only the question, the one question his entire reign had never required him to ask, because his entire reign had been built on the certainty that he already knew the answer to every question that mattered. What is she? The white wolf stilled, and Serafina, who had always been Serafina even now, even in this, even blazing white and ancient, and finally, the size she had always been, looked at Draven with eyes that were the same eyes she had been born with and carried through 19 years of invisibility and one night of everything, and beside her, Kale stepped forward. One step. Only one. He did not need more than one. He stood at the boundary between the forest and the world he had been kept from for 3 centuries, and he looked down at the last Alpha King the 5 territories would ever have. And he answered the question, mine, and the last Alpha King this land will ever need. The word fell into the morning air and did not echo. It simply settled into the ground, into the space between 500 men and the two things standing at the forest's edge, into the space behind Draven's eyes, where his certainty had been living and was not living anymore. Somewhere at the back of the retreating formation, a warrior went to one knee, not out of strategy, not because an order had been given or a protocol observed. He went to one knee the way the body goes to its knees when it has been in the presence of something that it recognizes, below the level of training, below the level of allegiance, below every layer of constructed loyalty that a life of service builds, as something that was always above the thing it has been kneeling for, then another, then 10, and then the field was going down, row by row, 500 men finding the ground before the white wolf and the chained god, who was not chained anymore, and Draven stood alone at the front of it all, the last man standing, with the morning light coming up cold and clear around him. He looked at Serafina, she looked back, and he understood, finally, completely, with the same cold clarity that had built everything he had ever built, that he had been managing the wrong thing for 20 years. He had been managing the god, containing the god, calculating around the god. He had never once thought to look for the one the god had been waiting for. Draven went to one knee, slowly, not with grace, not with the ease of a man accustomed to the gesture, with the specific, deliberate weight of a man performing an action that his whole life has been structured to make unnecessary, and doing it anyway because the evidence is what it is, and he has always, in the end, been a man who followed evidence. The last Alpha King in the 5 territories pressed one armored knee into the cold morning ground, and the field was quiet, and the forest was quiet, and the white wolf stood at the boundary between both worlds, exactly where she had always been meant to stand. Draven's surrender was not the end of a battle. It was the end of a lie. The long, careful, institutionalized lie that 300 years of deliberate forgetting had built into the foundation of every pack in the 5 territories. The lie that the god in the forest was a threat to be managed. The lie that the sacrifice was protection. The lie that power, simply contained for long enough, would eventually stop being what it was. The truth had been standing at the boundary the whole time. It had simply needed one night, and one girl, and the particular quality of a question asked without fear, to remember that it was allowed to walk out. The packs did not kneel to the god, that distinction mattered, and the 5 territories would remember it long after the morning of the blood moon had passed into story, that it was not fear that brought them to the ground, not the ancient, overwhelming power of the first Alpha, standing unchained and uncontained at the forest's edge. It was her. The elders of Ashvale were first the same 6 men who had walked her to the altar, who had spoken the binding words and turned their backs and run. They came forward from the retreating formation separately, as if they had found each other in the crowd, and agreed, wordlessly, that this was theirs to do. They knelt at the forest's edge, where the grass met the shadow of the first trees, and they did not look up, and they did not speak. And whatever that silence cost them was a cost the morning light offered them no relief from. The border packs followed, then the warriors who had faced Kale in the forest the night before, who had risen from the undergrowth and brushed the dead leaves from their armor and walked back to the formation and said nothing about what had happened to them, only stood quietly in their ranks and waited until this moment to show wordlessly, completely, that they had understood. They knelt to a girl who had eaten at the edges of every room she had ever occupied. A girl who had slept in the back of the elder house because no family had claimed her. A girl who had stood every morning at the village's eastern edge and looked into a forest that the whole world was afraid of and felt, in the looking, something that she had carried alone for 19 years and never once been given the language to name. She had not needed the language, she had only needed the night. Kale never returned to the forest's interior as a prisoner. The morning after the blood moon set, that thin, gray hour before the next sunrise, when the world sits between what it was and what it will be, the chains that had bound him for 300 years dissolved, not broken, not removed by any hand. They simply ceased to exist. The way the altar chains had ceased. The way the seal in Serafina's blood had ceased, as if the entire architecture of the imprisonment had been made of a material that required belief to remain solid, and the belief had finally run out. The ash fell into the roots of the old trees and disappeared. By noon that day, even the clearing where the altar had stood was gone. The stone sunk into the earth, the torches unmade. The ground where 11 generations of girls had stood simply forest floor again, unremarkable, covered in last year's leaves. as if it had been waiting a long time to be allowed to be nothing more than that. The 5 territories remade themselves slowly, the way land remakes itself after a long drought, not all at once, not with spectacle, but with the patient accumulation of small things returning to their right shapes. The border pack stopped fortifying their tree lines. The elder halls stopped keeping the old books, the ones with the names, the ones with the 100-year schedules, the ones with the blood mage contacts, and the chain formulas and the careful bureaucratic language of ritual that had turned the sacrifice of girls into a line item in a management report. Those books burned without anyone lighting them. Draven retired to the eastern coast of the territories, not exiled, not imprisoned, simply a man who had been the most powerful thing in a world that had reorganized itself around a different definition of power. He built a house on a cliff above the sea. He wrote a great deal and spoke very little. He was seen occasionally walking the cliff edge at dusk, looking east at the water, and he was always alone. What he thought about in those walks, no one ever knew. He never said. Kale and Serafina did not build a throne room. They did not construct a court, or establish a capital, or issue decrees through the formal channels that the 5 territories had built to receive such things. They did not replace one form of governance with another slightly different form wearing different colors. They simply were present in the territories the way the forest was present, the way the moon was present, not requiring acknowledgement, not demanding fealty, not sustaining themselves on the machinery of demonstrated authority, simply occupying the world with the particular, unhurried completeness of things that have always belonged to it and have finally been allowed to stand in it without apology. The packs felt it, the way you feel a change in the air before rain, not measurable, not visible, but real in every nerve ending that has ever learned to pay attention to what the world is doing. Something had gone out of the 5 territories that had been wrong for 3 centuries. Something cold and careful and built on fear had been removed. Like a splinter finely drawn from deep tissue, what replaced it had no name in any current language, but every wolf in every pack, on quiet nights, felt it in the howl that traveled the territory boundaries between dusk and full dark. Something carried on that sound that had not been there before, something ancient and warm and absolutely without threat, balance, the kind that does not require maintenance, the kind that simply holds. They were standing at the forest boundary when the first full dark of the new era settled over the territories. Not the blood moon, just the ordinary dark, the reliable, unthreatening dark that had always been there when the red sky was not. The dark that simply meant the sun had finished its work for the day, and the stars were coming up to do theirs. Serafina had her feet in the grass at the boundary line, 1 foot in the open field, 1 foot in the shadow of the first trees. Exactly where she had stood that morning. Exactly where she had stood. She understood now. Every morning of her life at the village's eastern edge. Without knowing why, she had always been standing at this line. She had simply not known. Yet what was waiting for her on the other side of it? Kale stood beside her, not behind her, not in front, beside the specific placement of something that has been alone for 300 years and has found, in the particular geometry of standing next to this one person, a configuration of the world that it intends to occupy for as long as the world permits. He was looking at the stars. She was looking at the forest, at the dark inside it that was no longer the dark of a prison, but simply the dark of a place that was resting, that was whole, that had finished the long exhale of 3 centuries and found, on the other side of it, exactly the quiet it had been owed. Then, without looking down at her, the way he said the things that mattered most, as if eye contact was too direct a delivery mechanism for certain kinds of truth. He spoke. You asked me my name on the altar. I gave you the one. They call me the name that exists in the stories and the histories and the mouths of the people who have feared me, but there is another name, the one I was given at the beginning of the world, before the world had decided what I was, before the packs, before the imprisonment, before 300 years of being only what someone else's fear required me to be. And oh, One has spoken it since the first. Moon, I'll tell you tonight. She turned and looked at him. At the breadth of him against the dark sky, the stars above his shoulders, the silver of his eyes catching the first light of the rising moon. Not red, not bloated, not the blood moon, with its ancient obligations and its hunger and its 100-year toll. Just the moon, ordinary and full and entirely itself, asking nothing of anyone. Simply present the way the best things are present. And Serafina Cole, who had been called Ashbourne and expendable and unwanted and nobody, who had eaten at the edges and slept in back rooms and stood alone at the tree line every morning for 19 years, smiled, not because she had won something, not because she had survived, though she had, not because the world had rearranged itself around the truth of what she was, though it had, not because a god who had been alone for 3 centuries was standing beside her with something in his eyes that was going to take a very long time to properly name, though that, too, was true. She smiled because she was for the first time, in the first full dark of a world that had finally stopped lying about what it was, entirely, completely, without reservation or apology, or the weight of someone else's fear pressing down on her from every direction, herself. And somewhere deep in the forbidden forest, which was forbidden no longer, which was simply the forest, which was simply the place where the oldest things lived, and had been living since before the word forbidden existed, the wolves began to sing, not the howl of warning, not the howl of the hunt or the boundary marking, or the formal announcement of a pack's presence in a territory, the oldest howl, the one that exists before language and after it, the one that means nothing translatable into words and everything that words were invented to approximate, the howl that simply says, we are here, we are whole, the long night is over, and the moon, ordinary, unhurried, asking nothing, rose. That is where Serafina's story ends, except it doesn't, because here is what the story did not tell you, Kale's true name, the one spoken at the beginning of the world. The one no living creature has heard since the first moon, does not simply belong to him. It is a key. And somewhere in the old territories, in the places that have not yet heard that the first Alpha walks free, and the first Luna stands beside him, there are things that have been waiting for that name to be spoken aloud, things that were there before the imprisonment, things that were there before the pacts, things that have had 300 years to decide what they will do the moment the world remembers what it actually is. The night Serafina learns that name is the night everything begins again. If this story found something in you tonight, if you felt Serafina stand on that altar and decided to stay, then you already know what to do. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. The next chapter is already taking shape. And I promise you what is coming for Serafina and Kale is not smaller than tonight. It is older, and it has been patient. If this story moved you, pass it on. Find the person in your life who would have stood on that altar and not begged either. Send it to them. Stories like this were always meant to travel. And before you go, I need to know one thing from you. Drop it in the comments right now. Team Kale, you were his from the moment the chains dissolved and you know it. Or Team Serafina chose the hardest thing because she did. And she deserves to be said so. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next one. Stay wild.